Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to everybody. Meine Damen und Herren, einen wunderschönen guten Tag. Enjoy your meal. We are having 3 events in one today. At first we have a light lunch. That is not so dramatic. Then we are having a kind of pre-opening of an exhibit. You see the pictures all around you. This exhibit is named Documentary Photography, Wüstenrot Foundation Award winners 2007-2008. It is a show of, as the title says, documentary photography, and the award is given by the Wüstenrot Foundation. Wüstenrot itself is a Bausparkasse. What is the translation for Bausparkasse? I don't know. It's a kind of... Yes, a mortgage bank is a little bit different. It's a kind of funny name, but health. Okay, something like that. But it's a very big one. And this kind of company doesn't exist in the United States. There isn't a real example here. The artists we show here are Andrea Diefenbach. You saw her photos downstairs, or you can see them when you go downwards. Then Aymeric Fouquet. His photos are in the big frames, in the break frames. Then Kirill Golovchenko, he is behind me. And Margaret Potter, her works are over there. But you are here for the third event, Cultural Life, a European-American dialogue on public-private partnership. As I told you, Wüstenrot Foundation is a private company, and we thought it would be good to have a kind of transatlantic discussion, perhaps, about what is public-private partnership meaning in Germany and here, and on the other hand, what is the kind of support from the state for art and culture in Germany and perhaps here. For this event, we have distinguished guests. I start with Rachel Goslins. She is Executive Director of the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanity. Kristina Hasenpflug. She is Head of Department for Education and Art at the Wüstenrot Foundation. And the presentation, the discussion will be moderated by my colleague, Gilcher. Ladies and gentlemen, let us greet our guests with a very warm round of applause. So, now we are starting, and I'm very curious. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Breis. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to the Goethe-Institut today for this discussion about cultural policy, a dialogue between Germany and the United States, and specifically about public-private partnerships. It's really a treat to have so many people here at lunch and to have such wonderful guests. A couple of things I wanted to say before we start about just how things will happen. The event is being recorded for WIDA's Forum Network, which public television has an online service about programs happening in the Washington area, and this is being recorded for that purpose. We're also recording it for sound for possible use by National Public Radio in Berlin. They have a service and they like to use some of these programs. So that's why we're using microphones, and later on in the question and answer period, Janina Hirsch who was in the back there, will bring a mic to you to ask your question. Now, I do ask that you speak up in asking your questions or in making a comment. so that everyone can hear you, because it looks a little silly to have all these mics when there's no loudspeakers, but that's the way it is. Okay. So I'm going to ask both Kristina Hasenpflug and Rachel Goslins to make a short opening statement really about what is the President's Committee on the Arts and the Humanities, what is the Wüstenrot Stiftung, what do they do, so to give us an idea of how that works. And then I'll ask them to each talk about funding for cultural life, the arts in general, in Germany and the United States, how that works briefly. We're not going to, these are not lectures, these are short statements so that we have a common ground to speak on. I'm very happy that Karen Carstens from the German Information Center at the Embassy has agreed to do some translation of Kristina's words into English. Kristina speaks English, she will understand everything, but she prefers to speak in German. And having done this sort of thing myself, I know exactly why, to be more precise and to speak at the intellectual level that one wants to. So we'll ask Karen to do the translation in consecutive form. So Kristina will say a few sentences, not too many, and then Karen will translate that into English for us. Okay. And we'd like to keep it an informal conversation. It's a real dialogue, so please keep that in mind in your questions and also in the presentations. So you were already both introduced, but let me say a couple more things, because I think a lot of people don't know so much about your personal backgrounds. I'll start with Kristina Hasenpflug from the Wüstenrot Foundation. She studied German philology, history, and political science in both Germany and France, and she wrote her doctoral thesis on Clemens Brentano's poetry. For 7 years, up until 2000, she was a scholar and curator at the Goethe Museum in Frankfurt am Main. I think I've heard of that guy. And since 2000, she's been head of culture and education at the Wüstenrot Foundation in Ludwigsburg, Germany, promoting projects in architecture, literature, photography, and short film. Rachel Goslin is the executive director of the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities. She is a documentary director, producer, and arts administrator. Her feature films include Bama Girl, an award-winning documentary following a black woman running for homecoming queen at the University of Alabama, and Bessa, thank you. Bessa, The Promise, a film about Albanian Muslims who saved Jews during World War II. She has worked on productions for National Geographic, Discovery, PBS, A&E, and the History Channel, as well as serving as the programming director for the Impact Film Festival, and as the director of the Independent Digital Distribution Lab, a joint PBS-ITVS project focused on distributing independent films online. Prior to her film career, Rachel was an international copyright attorney in the Office of Policy and International Affairs in the U.S. Copyright Office and for the law firm of Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. So, really thrilled to have you both here and that you both agreed to have this dialogue with us here in Washington. So let me start with the person who's come from greater distance. Kristina, if you could just place a little bit the Wüstenrot Foundation. What is this place? We don't know much about it, and then we'll ask Rachel to do the same for the President's Committee.
First, I want to thank for this invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here. And now I thank Karen for the translations. And now I switch to German to be more precise. And yeah, okay, thank you very much. Ja, die Wüstenrot Stiftung hat ihren Nukleus, wie Ulrich Präß das schon sagte, in einer Bausparkasse, die aber mittlerweile in einem Teil eines großen Konzerns ist, der sich in Finanzdienstleistungen einen großen Namen in Deutschland gemacht hat. Also es gibt neben der Bausparkasse Versicherungen und eine Bank. Und die Wüstenrot Stiftung ist Alleinaktionär einer Holding, die wiederum über 70% der Anteile des Wüstenrot- und Württembergischen Konzerns hält.
Yes, the Wüstenrot Foundation is the nucleus as was already stated by Mr. Brace, of a Bausparkasse, which is difficult to translate into English. And it's a type of bank in Germany. And it is, meanwhile, though, part of a bigger company that offers financial services and is the sole actionary in, was hatten Sie gesagt, 70%? 70%, sole actionary owns 70% of that company.
Also wir leben sozusagen von der Dividende des Konzerns und sind Mehrheitsaktionäre. Wichtig ist vielleicht noch zu wissen über die Wüstenrot Stiftung, dass wir 80% unserer Mittel in operative Projekte einsetzen. Das sind Projekte, die wir selbst konzipieren und auch managen und betreuen und nur 20% unseres Budgets in Zuwendungen einsetzen, womit wir andere Institute oder Vereinigungen unterstützen, die kulturelle und soziale Projekte verwirklichen möchten.
It's also important to say about the Wüstenrot Foundation that it lives off of the dividends of this company, and that 80% of its funds go into operative projects, and only 20% of these funds go into 20% finanzieren.
Zuwendungsprojekte.
20% of their funds finance specific projects in the cultural realm.
Von Dritten, das ist wichtig. Also, dass es nicht Eigenprojekte sind.
Sorry, 20% of their funds finance cultural projects from third parties.
Wir sind auf verschiedenen Feldern aktiv. Ein wichtiges Feld ist das Denkmalprogramm, in dem wir Baudenkmale der zeitgenössischen Moderne sanieren und einer neuen, und das ist auch wichtig, gemeinnützigen Nutzung zuführen.
They're also active in different fields in a program to preserve historic and cultural sites.
Und dabei ist es eben wichtig, dass wir als gemeinnützige Institution auch dafür sorgen, dass diese Baudenkmale in der Zukunft dann auch einer gemeinnützigen Nutzung zugeführt werden.
And also that the preservation of these cultural and historic buildings and sites are serve a common purpose for the public in future.
Dann haben wir ein Wissenschaftsprogramm, in dem wir uns hauptsächlich sozialwissenschaftlichen Projekten widmen.
They also have a scientific program that is primarily geared towards the social sciences.
Ein Bildungsprogramm, in dem wir junge Architekten, aber auch Journalisten mit außeruniversitären Fortbildungsprogrammen versorgen.
And also an education program which helps young architects and other experts.
Zur außeruniversitären Fortbildung.
Outside of their traditional university experience.
Und im Kunstbereich fördern wir junge Fotografen. Da möchte ich jetzt erstens nur dieses Fotoprojekt vorstellen, das man hier sehen kann.
And in the area of the arts, they also foster young photographers such as you see here in this exhibit.
Vielleicht noch kurz zu diesem Förderpreis. Dieser Preis wird alle 2 Jahre verliehen an 4 junge Dokumentarfotografen und sie bekommen ein Stipendium zur Realisierung eines unabhängigen freien Projektes.
And the prize that the young photographers received, who you see exhibited here, receive a stipend from the Wüstenrot Foundation that helps them realize independent projects.
Und danach finanziert die Stiftung eine Ausstellung mit Begleitkatalog und eine Wanderausstellung, um den jungen Fotografen Öffentlichkeit zu verschaffen. Das ist unser Hauptanliegen.
And their main concern here is to provide the young photographers with greater exposure, and after this exhibit there will also be, the Wüstenrot Foundation will finance a catalog and a traveling exhibit of their photographic works.
Thank you. Rachel, tell us, what is this President's Committee?
Is this President's Committee? Well, first, I just want to thank the Institute for inviting me here. I work not too far from here, and have been fortunate enough to come to the Institute as a tourist for different events and exhibits. So it's nice to be here, to be invited to be here in my official capacity. I was talking to Kristina before the panel, and she said that, who speaks English incredibly well. She said that she could understand me as long as I spoke slowly, which is sadly not my strong point. So if I start ramping up momentum, if somebody in the audience could just go like this, it'll remind me to slow down. The President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities is an advisory committee to the White House on cultural issues. The First Lady is the honorary and fairly active chairwoman. And the committee itself is made up of two groups of people, which is actually very relevant to our discussion today. Part of the committee are the heads of all of the federal agencies and institutions that have a role in culture, which includes the major grant-making institutions such as the the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We're fortunate to have here with us today somebody from the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the NEH, as well as institutions like the Smithsonian Institution. We have a representative of the Smithsonian here with us today, the Library of Congress, the National Gallery, the Kennedy Center, and also the larger agencies that aren't exclusively focused on culture but have that as part of their central mission. The Secretary of Education sits on the committee, the Secretary of State, the head of the General Services Administration, which is responsible for design in federal buildings. So all of these federal officials sit on our committee, as well as a group of private citizens that are appointed by each administration. And these private citizens are selected for their commitment and activism in arts and culture, and represent some of this country's most leading artists, actors, authors, architects, dancers, but also entrepreneurs, philanthropists, and business people who have been major supporters of arts and culture. So it's really an amazing table to sit at. The committee was founded in 1982 by President Reagan. Frank Sinatra, I hear, was on the first President's Committee in the Arts and Humanities. Sorry, I missed that. And really why it was founded is core to what I think we're here to discuss today. One is, in this country, as everybody here knows, we don't have a Ministry of Culture, and so there is no coordination on federal cultural policy. So the President's Committee is the only place in government where all of the folks who run the agencies and institutions that determine collectively our approach to the arts and culture actually sit down together and talk together. We don't have a mandate to force them to collaborate or cooperate, but it provides a forum for collaboration and cooperation in these areas. And it also provides a nexus between the private and the public sector because of the private citizens that sit on the committee. It provides a place for these two major areas to talk to each other and to collaborate on things. It was formed not only to provide this federal nexus, but also to explicitly, in the executive order that created us, to encourage public-private partnerships in the arts. And at the time, that's changed a little bit in recent years, where you now see some of these agencies on their own really emphasizing and seeking public-private partnerships for some of their major initiatives. But at the time, it was two totally separate worlds, two different ways of funding the arts. And this committee's real mandate was to try and create more partnerships. We operate primarily in the area of arts and humanities education, cultural exchange and diplomacy, and the creative economy, investment in cultural and creative assets to increase wealth and economy in our cities and towns. So in all of these areas, we run projects, we hold forums, we convene people, we run ongoing programs And everything we do, almost without exception, is both a collaboration between more than one federal agency and involves both federal and private funds.
Thank you. Our two countries, Germany and the United States, and more largely sort of North America and Europe, have quite different histories in terms of how we fund arts and cultural life. And therefore, let me just say in a sentence something about that and ask then our two speakers to speak more about how are the arts and cultural life funded in the United States and in Germany. But the tradition in Europe is that somehow, kind of for historic reasons, the state, the local lord, the seigneur in the corner, he was the one, or she was the one, but usually he, to make cultural life happen. And therefore, there's a tradition that grows out of that it is the responsibility of the state to do these things. It's expected that the state will do these things, whether the state meaning very local government or at the largest heights of government. In the United States, of course, we have a completely different tradition, and there are many people who say that, well, really, government has no role to play in culture. That is something that belongs to the private sector, to citizens, to citizen initiatives, and that I can remember discussions about this a few years ago. We don't want a cultural policy for the United States. We want everybody to bring to the national life or the local life their own thoughts about culture and find ways to do that. So there's really quite different directions. Now let's just look for a minute at how is then, given those parameters, and I think I've got them right, but correct me if I've misspoken, how is it in Germany, for instance, which is also a federal republic like the United States, how are arts and cultural life funded?
Also es gibt verschiedene Geldgeber der öffentlichen Hand, das ist einmal der Bund, die Länder und die Gemeinden, die kulturelle Einrichtungen und Initiativen finanzieren, also das kulturelle Leben finanzieren.
First of all, in Germany, there's the public sector provides funding for the arts on 3 levels: the federal level, the state level, and the local or regional level.
Dabei muss man aber wissen, dass die Ausgaben der gesamten öffentlichen Haushalte für den Kulturbereich doch letztlich nur 1,6% des Gesamtbudgets der öffentlichen Haushalte betragen. Also das ist eine sehr geringe Zahl.
Despite this fact of arts funding through public arts funding in Germany, only 1.6% of the total governmental budgets in Germany go to arts funding, which is not a very high number.
Darüber hinaus gibt es natürlich auch Unternehmen und auch Privatleute und natürlich auch Stiftungen, gemeinnützige, wie auch Stiftungen, die nicht als gemeinnützig anerkannt sind, die sich bemühen, das kulturelle Leben am Laufen zu halten in Deutschland.
In addition, in Germany, there are also companies and other private sector initiators who support the arts in Germany and are not always incorporated in the public sector.
Rachel, what about the U.S.?
So the most recent information we have on this comes out of a NEA study that came out in 2007, but looked at data from 2004, which was a very different economy, so I'm sure the margins have shifted somewhat. But as a general matter, and speaking only about the nonprofit arts world, which is relevant for a reason a distinction I'll make in a moment, about 44% of the funds used by nonprofit arts organizations in this country come from earned income. So ticket sales, t-shirt sales, subscriptions, that kind of thing. 13% comes from the federal government, of which about 9% is federal, and of which 1% is the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, which is the agency that's sort of specifically and explicitly tasked with funding nonprofit arts organizations in this country. And about 43% come from philanthropic donations, which include individuals, corporations, and foundations. Overall, the combined budget of our three major cultural grant-making organizations, the NEA and the NEH and IMLS, is about $620 million a year. Which I would love if somebody gave to me, but you know, seen in a vacuum, it's not very much. Definitely less than 1% of our country's budget, and lots of people like to make the point that it's less than 0.003% of what we spend in some of our operations in other countries in a given week. So it's easy to look at that and say that the United States doesn't, and I think it's true as a general matter, that doesn't spend the same that the European countries do on culture. There are a couple caveats to that. One is this is only the nonprofit art sector. There's obviously films and music and all kinds of media arts and all kinds, and architecture and all kinds of for-profit enterprises that we would consider culture or arts and don't fall under this rubric. It also doesn't, the 620 number doesn't include the funding for other cultural institutions and agencies in the federal government that aren't primarily grant-making organizations, but you know, the Department of Education has a large budget that it spends, of which it spends a portion on arts education. The State Department has money that it spends on cultural exchange and dialogue. The Smithsonian has a number of fantastic programs and you know, contributes a lot to this field. So that's one area that this number is a little misleading. Likewise, it also doesn't include tax breaks, and I'm actually not clear about how that works in Europe, but the nonprofit status, the amount of you know, it's not direct funds, but the amount of support that nonprofit arts organizations get through tax breaks for what they do is also substantial and not quantified in those numbers.
Do you mean like when I give money to an arts organization and the fact that I can deduct part of that from my income?
Both. You get a tax break which encourages you to donate to arts organizations, but also by virtue of being a 501c3, you don't pay taxes. So this 44% of generated income that these nonprofit theaters or music schools or other activities are making, you know, they receive a tax benefit that as a result of being a nonprofit organization.
Right. Okay. I'm glad you mentioned also the large role, a vital role of the creative industries in the United States in terms of the arts. That is a very important part of our cultural life. So that's a hefty percentage of that kind of activity is on the for-profit side. What is the situation in Germany? Can I also, if I were a German taxpayer, would I be able to deduct something? Or if I were running a theater, would I be able to run that without paying taxes to anybody?
Also es ist ein sehr ähnliches System in Deutschland. Es gibt eine Steuerbefreiung für sogenannte gemeinnützige Organisationen und dazu zählen auch Theater oder Museen und dergleichen.
There's a similar system in Germany, and there are tax breaks for nonprofit organizations such as theaters and dance halls.
Und das Gleiche gilt auch für Unternehmen, Privatpersonen und Stiftungen, die solche Organisationen unterstützen. Die müssen nämlich auch können sozusagen für die Summe, die sie stiften, eine Steuerbefreiung erhalten, beziehungsweise sie vom Gewinn abziehen, je nachdem.
And the same thing holds true for companies, individuals, private individuals, and foundations, and they can also receive tax breaks or subtract them from their income.
Und vor einigen Jahren gab es auch eine Novellierung des Stiftungsgesetzes, bei dem man das auch nochmal erleichtert hat, diese Steuerabschreibungen.
And a few years ago, there was a change to the law regulating this for foundations, which made this easier. The process was simplified.
um mehr Leute dazu anzuregen, sich eine Stiftung zu gründen und sich für das Gemeinwohl zu engagieren.
And this law was intended to encourage more people to take the initiative to start their own foundations and nonprofits to encourage the arts further in Germany.
Wobei mir eine Umfrage vorliegt aus dem Jahr 2007.
And I do have a questionnaire here, or a survey from the year 2007.
Bei dem knapp 300 Unternehmen befragt wurden, warum sie kulturelle Projekte unterstützen.
And this survey, some 300 companies were asked questions, why do they fund the arts?
Als ersten Punkt nannten sie möchten gesellschaftliche Verantwortung übernehmen.
The first point they mentioned is that they wanted to take some responsibility for society, enhance society.
Und über 70%, und das war damit der zweitwichtigste Punkt, nannten Imagepflege als Beweggrund für ihr philanthropisches Engagement.
And the second key point to note here is that more than 70% of these companies mentioned polishing their own image or improving their own image was the key motivating factor in doing so.
Und das bedeutet meiner Ansicht nach, dass auch also wenn man die kulturelle Förderung allein in private oder unternehmerische Hände gibt, dass exotischere oder vielleicht nicht so breitenwirksame Bereiche des kulturellen Lebens keine Chance mehr haben auf Öffentlichkeit.
And in my opinion, this means that if funding for the arts and cultural programs is primarily in the hands of the private sector or funded by private means, this would perhaps limit the extent to which more exotic or offbeat cultural programs would be funded.
It's so interesting that you say that, because I think the American experience here has been the opposite, that sometimes the government is not at its strongest in pushing the envelope, in funding risk-taking in the arts, partially because it's hard, it's hard to acknowledge and spot that ahead of time, and also because it in our party system, it opens up that kind of action to a lot of criticism. It's safer to stick, and often more prudent to stick with kind of mutually acknowledged value. So we find that corporations and individuals especially, and foundations are much more available to take a risk, to gamble on something more controversial or something more thought-provoking, and something untested than the government. That the government is sometimes better at validating and reinforcing much more kind of commonly held values and principles in the area of the arts.
Das ist interessant. Ich denke, dass das auch für deutsche Stiftungen zum größten Teil zutrifft, die gemeinnützig orientiert arbeiten.
That's very interesting, because I think that this applies definitely to German foundations that work in the non-profit sector.
Und dadurch nicht daran interessiert sind, unbedingt in erster Linie eine Imagepflege zu betreiben.
And through that, they're less interested to polish their image or present a good image.
Aber es ist kein Vergleich zu dem, was die öffentliche Hand, allen voran auch die Kommunen, gemacht hat im Bereich der Förderung von jungen Künstlern.
But it is still not a comparison. There's no comparison to what the public sector has done, especially the local level, local and regional governments, notably in supporting young artists.
Indem sie Atelierhäuser zur Verfügung gestellt hat, indem junge Künstler wie ein kleines Start-up-Unternehmen sich einmieten konnten oder vielleicht auch die Möglichkeit der Nutzung umsonst bekommen haben. Oder solche Programme gibt es auch für junge Filmemacher, für Musiker, die eben Übungsräume dann seitens der Stadt umsonst zur Verfügung gestellt bekommen, ohne Ansehen dessen, was sie da nun eigentlich machen und ohne den Blick auch auf eine Öffentlichkeit dessen.
This applies in particular to the local and regional governments in Germany have supported young artists, for example, in providing atelier space, spaces for them to work. This applies to young artists such as painters or young filmmakers, musicians, and they have received quite a lot of support at the local level in Germany without these governments investigating what they're doing at all times, or thinking what kind of audience will receive this work. It's more just a nice way of supporting them.
So it's so interesting. I'm totally going off script here, so I'm sorry if I say something on the internet that's imprudent, but I'll be the first person to ever do that. But it occurs to me as you're talking that there is a gap in sort of the professional life of an artist in this country as a gross generalization. And I'm talking mostly about federal government because I have less experience with local and regional governments. But we put a lot of time and energy in supporting arts education, and it's an acceptable societal goal to use federal funds, again as a gross generalization, to support arts education and arts students, whether they're musicians or artists or actors, in their education. And then there's this kind of gap where you're sort of on your own from the federal point of view, again, gross overgeneralization, to make it or not, and to figure out if you can, in your own community and with your own wherewithal, and if you have enough passion and you're willing to live on top ramen, I don't know if you have that in Germany, for long enough, you establish a body of work, you establish yourself, you create a reputation, and then sort of mid-career is when you start meeting the applications for some of these grants and the funding that's available for artists, from the government. And so I think it's partially a disinclination to get involved with artists that have not yet fully arrived at who they are or what they're trying to say, because there's a worry about supporting art on from a national perspective that doesn't reflect the national consciousness and priorities. And also a sense that, for a while you're kind of on your own and you have to sort of sink or swim on the value of your art and your ability to make it, and then there's a point at which there are more federal resources available to step in and support them.
A question for you, Kristina. Is the Wüstenrot Foundation a rarity in Germany, or are there a number of similar foundations that support young artists?
Ja, ich denke, ja, also wir sind sicherlich eine der größeren Unternehmensstiftungen, aber es gibt sehr viele Stiftungen, auch von privaten Personen, die Kunst und Kultur im weitesten Sinne fördern.
I think, yes, we are one of the biggest corporate foundations funding the arts in Germany, but there are also many other initiatives, even from private individuals and other companies.
Do you ever have a time when the board of the commercial side, the for-profit side of Wüstenrot, comes to you and says, this wasn't such a great idea?
Nein, das passiert überhaupt nicht, weil wir haben den Status der Gemeinnützigkeit.
No, this never really happens to us because we have a non-profit status.
Und wir achten sehr darauf, diesen auch zu behalten, indem wir uns aus dem operativen Unternehmensgeschäft herausziehen und diese ganzen Vorgänge einer Holding überlassen.
And we really strive to maintain this status by keeping out of the entrepreneurial, the business side of things and maintain that status that way.
Und dann muss man ja auch sehen, dass wir sozusagen die Anteilseigner des Unternehmens sind. Wir sind nicht vom Unternehmen gestiftet in diesem Sinne, sondern sind sozusagen die Abhängigkeitsverhältnisse sind andere. Also das Unternehmen oder der Vorstand des Unternehmens, des Konzerns, ist nicht in der Situation, von uns Auskünfte zu erwarten über unsere Tätigkeit oder Einfluss zu nehmen auf unsere Stiftungsarbeit.
Because of our status within the company, the board of directors, for instance, is not in a position to actually tell us what to do.
Okay. We see an example around us of how Wüstenrot Foundation has brought 4 young photographers to Washington. All of them, none of them Americans, for instance, to bringing them abroad. How does this, and I'll ask a parallel question to you, Rachel, how does this work in the international arena? Why does Wüstenrot want to bring these German and French artists to the United States, for instance? What does that do for your foundation? And then the next response, what do we do in the United States about taking young artists or any artists abroad? And is that really such a minor part that it isn't worth talking about?
Für die Wüstenrot Stiftung bringt diese Aktivität nichts.
For the Wüstenrot Foundation, this activity does not really benefit it.
Aber unser Ziel mit diesem Projekt ist es ja, jungen Dokumentarfotografen Öffentlichkeit zu verschaffen. Und der zeitgenössische Kunstmarkt funktioniert übernational, international. Und deswegen wäre es für die jungen Künstler unbefriedigend, wenn wir unsere Aktivitäten in diesem Bereich nur auf Deutschland beschränken würden.
But our main goal with this project with these young photographers is to give them as much exposure as possible because the contemporary art market does not function in isolation. For instance, in Germany, it is international, and our goal is to help them that way.
Rachel, what do we do in the international arena?
You know, we do quite a bit. We being the federal government and also the President's Committee, cultural exchange and dialogue has always been a focus of the committee, and actually was really developed under the Bush administration, under the President's Committee and the Bush administration. That committee took a very active interest in international affairs. The committee believes, and I think most of our partners believe, that arts and culture are really one of the greatest tools we have in creating dialogue and building bridges and in, you know, undermining a little bit the us and them mentality that can cause a lot of problems on a personal level and a government level around the world. So what is powerful about the arts, what's powerful about these photographs or an amazing documentary or narrative film or a great work of art is it's not lecturing you, it's not telling you what to think. What it does is kind of allow you to put yourself in the shoes or behind the eyes of somebody else who may seem completely foreign from you, or very different, and yet your issues are very similar. One of the President's Committee for a number of years has had a program that sends independent filmmakers, both American and international, and pairs them and sends them to embassies all over the world to do outreach in local communities, in regional areas, in universities, to host screenings and then talk about these films. And it also brings them here domestically. We just announced a new partnership with the Sundance Institute in this area. And you have a documentary, a PBS documentary made about, you know, a rural wheat farmer in Iowa who is struggling in the economy, and you know, is his son going to stay and work the farm or go work in a city, and that. And it's so regional and it's so specific in such a tiny slice of life, and then you show it, you know, in a far-flung province in China, and you have people there who say, that's me, that's my experience, this is what I'm struggling with. So as a baseline, obviously, we think that this is a hugely important tool and value, and we do a lot in that area. The State Department has its own department specifically for educational and cultural affairs, which is in the Office of Public Diplomacy, and they fund American artists and nonprofit organizations to go around the world performing and doing educational workshops and master classes and interacting in service of the same goals. They just announced a fantastic visual arts program. I think it's a $2 million program in partnership with the Brooklyn Museum of Art. I may be getting their title wrong, to pick an American visual artist and send them for residencies in other countries to engage a local community to collaboratively create a work of art that will then stay in that community. And so to work with local artists and learn about their history and culture and together create something that becomes a part of that community, very kind of high profile artists from a lot of different genres. So the Smithsonian does a tremendous amount of work internationally and collaborative projects with scholars and artists and historians everywhere. You can always do more, and I'm a big advocate of doing more in this area, but a number of these agencies and organizations, including the NEA and the NEH, who have international departments, are all working on how do we use the particular value and opportunity presented by the arts to touch people, to reach people, to get to them in a different way, to create more unity and a vision and shared values.
Okay.
Das denke ich auch, dass das wirklich ein Kern der Kunst- und Kulturförderung sein muss, Künstlern die Möglichkeit zur Kommunikation zu geben, Kommunikationsplattformen zu schaffen, Foren zu schaffen, auch des internationalen Austauschs. Also das halte ich auch für einen ganz essentiellen Aspekt der modernen Kunst- und Kulturförderung.
I also think that it's a very key, essential component, core aspect of modern arts funding to support international dialogue and international projects along these lines.
I would make the point that this is, at least from the federal level, a harder argument in times of very tight economy. We spend a lot of time arguing that the arts are worthy of significant investment by our federal government, and a lot of those, especially in times of need when people are out of a job and there's real hardship across the country. It's hard to argue that kids should be getting a violin teacher as opposed to more reduced lunches. So that's a hard time. And similarly, when we're making the argument for the arts and why the arts are good for this country and for cities and towns, and that they build up tax bases and they make places attractive to small businesses to come and live, and they bring in tourism dollars. It's a harder argument as everything is in a hard economy, to say we should take these resources and be spending them looking externally instead of internally.
That was really, thanks for making the bridge, because that was really my last question before I opened it to the audience. We've been going through in the last 2 years economic crisis worldwide. Germany and Europe are certainly as affected as the United States. We're coming in or out of it, perhaps at a different rate, we don't know. But how do you see, each of you, from your own perspectives, the next couple of years in terms of cultural funding, the atmosphere for cultural funding in the two countries? There's a hard moment that I'm more close to what's happening in Washington than what's happening in Germany, but nonetheless, you must have similar things happening there. How would you characterize what's happening now, what people are talking about in terms of cultural funding in Germany, for instance? Is it important? Who needs it?
Also die Kunst- und Kulturszene in Deutschland fürchtet harte Zeiten in den nächsten Jahren.
The cultural and art scene in Germany is quite fearful of hard times ahead in the years to come.
Durch den Einbruch der Gewerbesteuereinnahmen haben die Kommunen fast keinen Haushalt mehr für die Kulturbereiche zur Verfügung, für den Kulturbereich zur Verfügung.
Because of a breakdown in income tax revenues, the local and regional governments have less funding available for the arts in Germany.
würde ich noch mal
It's a
präzisieren.
different kind of tax.
Oh, sorry, the Gewerbesteuer is
Ja,
von...
das ist die Steuer, die Unternehmen am Ort auf ihren Gewinn zahlen, aber nicht Income.
Oh, yeah, okay. I apologize. It's not the income tax. It's the tax that companies pay for their
Local business taxes?
local business
Yeah.
taxes. Breakdown of local business taxes.
Und genau. Andererseits haben die Unternehmen, die keine starken wirtschaftlichen Einbußen hinnehmen mussten, und davon gibt es ja in Deutschland auch glücklicherweise noch manche, bekräftigt, ihr kulturelles Engagement in den nächsten Jahren fortzusetzen.
Some companies that have suffered less in Germany have, on the other hand, stated that they will continue to fund the arts and will try to strive to enhance their funding of the arts. So that's good news.
Und bei den Stiftungen ist es natürlich dasselbe. Die Stiftungen, die nicht durch große Anlageverluste, die keine großen Anlageverluste erlitten haben, werden sicherlich weiterhin im gewohnten Umfang tätig sein.
And the same thing goes for foundations that have not suffered as much financially, that still have some reserves. They will continue with business as usual in terms of funding the arts in Germany.
Thank you. Gilcher, how's it look here?
Fantastic. You know, it's a hard time for the arts. It's a hard time for the arts here. At the federal level, you know, all of our funding comes through Congress. Everybody is very aware of, you know, both politically and economically what's going on. We lost a huge champion for the arts in Senator Ted Kennedy, who was really at the forefront of making that argument to the country that this was a worthwhile investment. I mean, I assume that was a rhetorical question, is it worth it? You know, I would argue in times of great need is really when we need the most, the arts and culture to remind us of who we are, and history to remind us of what we've come through, and to give us a vision and a hope for the future. The interesting thing is, and you know, again, this may change in the future, but even in this economy, arts, the federal chunk of arts funding has remained relatively stable and inched up every once in a while. So it's definitely under threat, and I think it would be very optimistic to hope that it gets drastically expanded anytime in the near future. But so far, we haven't seen any significant shrinkage in the federal sector. Where we have seen a huge impact is in private contributions, both because the companies and corporations and foundations are themselves economically affected, so they have a lot less money available to them, and because in times of, you know, food lines and huge hardship in their communities, it's harder for them to justify investing in kind of a longer-term strategy for this country's well-being, as opposed to meeting immediate needs like food and healthcare. So this is one of both the strengths and the weaknesses of our system, which relies tremendously on private donations, which is on some level it's less subject to political will or individual, you know, the droit, whatever, the one person who decides how important it is, but it's also really vulnerable to economic and other priorities. So, and then on top of it, all the earned income goes down because less people go to the theater and less people subscribe and less people go to ballet and, you know, all of that. So really, so far at least, the private sector supports what's taken the greatest hit, and I don't see that changing anytime in the future. There are quite a few foundations and corporations who are really committed to arts and culture, and, you know, God bless them, because without them I don't think you know, many of the organizations that we all treasure would still be in existence. But they're getting fewer and fewer, and they're also pushing, and this is another impact on the arts community, they're pushing increasingly for metrics and data and proof that what they're supporting is actually making a difference, especially in the area of arts education, but also in some areas, that their money is doing something. And while that is completely reasonable, and indeed I think some of that is definitely, will ultimately be a benefit to the arts community, what it means is now struggling arts organizations not only don't have the same resources available to them or the same, you know, kind of audience base, but they also now are being asked to spend resources that they don't have on evaluations or, you know, metrics or outcomes again, not unreasonable, but just another layer of demand that's being made on organizations that are already in crisis.
In Deutschland gab es jetzt einen Fall, bei dem der Versuch einer Kommune, ein kommunales Museum zu retten in Bremen, darin heiß diskutiert wurde. Nämlich das Museum hat, um die Sanierung des Museumsgebäudes zu sichern, beschlossen, einige Stücke aus der Sammlung zu verkaufen.
Oh. In Germany, there was a bit of a local scandal or local uproar when a local government decreased the funding. Yeah, decreased funding, and one particular museum in Bremen, in northern Germany, decided to sell some of its own pieces from its own collection to finance its own renovation.
Es war eine Maßnahme, die erstmalig in Deutschland war. Also das gab es vorher noch nicht, dass ein öffentliches Museum, ein kommunales Museum sich von Sammlungsstücken getrennt hat, um ein Finanzloch zu stopfen.
This was a historic first in Germany. This was the first time ever that a museum in Germany took such a drastic measure to plug a hole in its finances and the finances for funding of the arts in this city in Bremen.
Und mich würde
Public museum.
Ja, mich würde interessieren, ob es das auch in den USA gibt.
Are there cases like this in the U.S.?
You know, so far the Emancipation Proclamation at the National Archives isn't on the block, but I don't know. I mean, in our system, the holdings of the national museums, and I don't know what would happen if a private institution that got a lot of federal funding decided that it had to cannibalize its own collection to move forward. But the national museums, the Smithsonian museums, they hold their holdings in trust for the American people. So I don't actually think they have the legal right.
National museum.
I'm really going far outside of my comfort zone here, but I actually don't think the national museums, the Smithsonian, the Archives, the Library of Congress, are the owners of what they hold, so they wouldn't have the legal right to sell it because they're holding it in trust.
Let's turn to the audience. Some questions. Please, the microphone's coming to you, and speak directly into it.
Thank you. My name is John Brown. I teach at Georgetown University. I have two quotations to try to get your reactions to state support of the arts. The first one is by Sumner Welles, who was Undersecretary of State during Roosevelt administration and had a lot to do with the creation of the Division of Cultural Relations of the State Department. He said, "The concept of an official culture is alien to us." And the second one is by an American artist who said, "I'm all in favor of a Ministry of Culture so I can know who my enemies are."
Well, since those are both Americans, I'll take those first, but I'd be really interested in your reaction, Kristina. I think I can absolutely understand Undersecretary Wells' quote, because we have, as Bill said at the outset, we have a much more bottoms-up idea of culture, that culture comes from us and comes, and then you get into the federal and the states issue, and the idea of imposing some kind of top-down idea of culture is completely foreign to us, also partially because of how long we've been around as a country and having evolved from this crazy melting pot that doesn't have a kind of common point of reference that goes back 800 years or 1,000 years, of which you can see a somewhat linear evolution. We sort of sprang out of whole cloth, and we are made up of all these different things just in terms of individual cultures, much less different states and different. So the idea, and I'm a huge fan of culture, of some kind of umbrella organization telling me what American culture was, would be alien to me too. So I get that. I don't quite understand the culture so that you know who your enemies are. I don't actually understand what he was trying to get to with that quote.
Well, it's the artist and the bureaucrat, basically. But, you know, the ministry defines the culture, demands certain results, metrics from the artist, and the last thing I think an artist really wants is to undergo a procedure of being under metrics.
Well, if your enemy is also the one tasked with supporting you, I think that puts you in a difficult bind. But I'm curious, the top-down, bottoms-up approach to, you know, at a general level, what is German culture? Does your government feel, as a people, do they feel like there's enough of a consensus about that the government could articulate that without get it right?
Das ist eine schwierige Frage, weil im Moment ja gerade auch, also schon seit einigen Jahren, aber gerade derzeit auch wieder stark diskutiert wird, ob es das überhaupt gibt, eine deutsche Kultur. Da wird das schöne Wort der deutschen Leitkultur wurde auch kreiert und diskutiert. Und
yes, this is a very difficult question too for Germany, because this is hotly debated and being discussed also right now in Germany. What is German culture? And there is a particular term that's been bandied about in Germany, the Deutsche Leitkultur, or a German leading culture, and what is that?
Und ich denke aber, dass der Staat, also der Bund, die Länder und auch die Gemeinden relativ freie Kultur fördern. Also das sieht man ja auch an einer Institution wie das Goethe-Institut, das sozusagen vor Ort bestimmt, was an deutscher Kultur an den jeweiligen Standort vermittelt wird. Also es gibt kein feststehendes Programm, das weltweit abgespult wird, sondern es ist sozusagen in der Verantwortung des jeweiligen Instituts, was möchten wir aus der weiten Breite der deutschen Kultur vor Ort zeigen. Und das halte ich eigentlich für die beste Form der Kulturförderung.
Yes, in Germany, at the same time, there is not strict control over the federal level, the state level, or the local level, how funding is allocated for culture and the arts, and it can be relatively freely decided in Germany where funds are allocated. It's not very strictly controlled, and an excellent example of that is, for example, the Goethe-Institut, where you're sitting right now. The Goethe-Institutes all over the world represent German culture, but there is no one defined single program dictating from above what each Goethe-Institute has to do, and the Goethe-Institutes are relatively free to decide.
Totally free.
Totally free to decide wherever they are located and what their programs are going to be, and I believe that this is the best form of cultural programming, that you can kind of pick and choose from this broad palette of culture available in and from Germany and presented abroad in this manner.
Und dann, wie Sie ja auch am Anfang sagten, haben wir natürlich eine jahrhundertelange Tradition der Kulturförderung durch Obrigkeit und Staatlichkeit. Also das ist für Europäer etwas ganz Normales. Also diese Berührungsängste mit öffentlichen, also heute dann öffentlichen Geldern, früher eben Staatsgeldern, das gibt es bei uns in der Form, denke ich, nicht.
And it is true what you said earlier about public funding of the arts in Germany, because of this tradition of hundreds of years of linear development of certain culture, that there's not this fear of coming into contact in Germany, perhaps as much in the arts community, of coming into contact with public funding from above, that this is too top-down and too controlled.
Or that it's also a standard, it's expected that the government, someone, whatever that is, will provide support for these things. It's an expectation.
Yeah, I wanted to make one point connected to that. There's, you know, and we haven't really broken this down, but there's a lot of strength and a lot of weaknesses in both approach. You know, more federal or government funding and more entrepreneurial emphasis, more philanthropic funding and different economic climates show up the strengths and weaknesses of both of those. But I think from my perspective and from the committee perspective, there is one thing that Europe gets much more right than we do, that comes out of this sort of unquestioned commitment to funding the arts. At what level and how is always up for discussion, but there is no question, I think, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, that in Europe that culture is important, that it is a value and that it is essential to the country's identity, to the country's continuity, and that it should be supported. Again, the how is up in the air, what we see in this country too often is a questioning of that basic premise. Is this really worth it? Is this really, what does this do? What has this done for me lately? With the snap. So I think that even leaving the money amounts aside, the message that is sent by the ongoing and significant commitment to funding arts and culture in Europe just sets a national tone in which it would be, you'd really be in the minority if you were questioning the basic premise that this was a value that your country should support, whether at the government level or as a private citizen. And I'm frustrated in this country that we don't, often that basic premise is questioned.
Is this something you're working on in the committee? Do you have discussions about this sort of thing?
We talk about these kinds of things all the time, and because it's America, we talk about branding and marketing and messaging and how we, are not just preaching to the choir. Many of whom I'm sure are in the room, but people who don't feel or see the way that arts enriches their lives, who define the arts as opera and ballet and not as the movies they watch or the church choir that they sing in, or the arts and crafts summer camp classes that their child goes to and loves so much more than school itself. So there's a number of messaging issues that I think the arts has in this country, and then it's subject to all kinds of political football in lots of ways. As are many different issues in this country, but this is something we spend a lot of time talking about.
Okay. There's a question back there. Just wait a second while the mic comes to you.
Thank you. Leon Seaman from Cultural Tourism DC. Thank you for coming and talking to us today. My question is about the U.S. model. Looking at it's an interesting veer off of what you were just talking about, the core value. We're constantly questioning of whether is it worth it, talk of return on investment, metrics, and all of that. In the current funding environment, what tends to happen is you have a $200,000 program, and you end up going to 30 or 40 different sources to get $5,000 chunks, $10,000 chunks, if you're looking 25 or more $1,000 chunks. And the metrics, as you say, seems like a very reasonable request, except for when the metrics are just as onerous for a $5,000 donation as it is for a $50,000 donation, and the fact that the company, the foundation or funding source for the $5,000 has a different way they want to see the numbers than the way that the $50,000 organization wants to see their numbers, and it's the same organization. Has the Council looked at any efforts at either setting a threshold for saying under $10,000 will be a little easier on you, or possibly even looking at some sort of national standard on the reporting, so that both the federal, the local governments, and the state governments and the foundations are all on the same page? So if you have to do the report, at least you only have to do it once.
So I'm not sure we can set any. We can't do anything, but I'm not sure it's feasible to try and control private giving and say if you want to give $5,000 to this project, you can, but you can't ask them for this. That isn't something that's within the federal government's power. Those are contracts between.
Well, even the NEA sometimes does $5,000, $10,000 chunks.
Mm-hmm. So, so that's true. I completely feel your pain. I really do. The burdens of kind of evaluation are something the whole field is concerned with. There are some efforts now to, another problem is depending on the project. There is no, you couldn't come up with a generic set of standards because this is an arts ed program or a performance program for seniors. Is it something that where you're trying to mentor artists and so the metrics are going to be about how good their outcomes are, or is it something where you're trying to touch an audience and it's about, or trying to influence the local economy? There are, I think, catching up to this emphasis on standards and metrics is an acknowledgement that there's a need for more standardization in these outcomes. I know the Wallace Foundation is doing some work on this in the areas of grant making that they're doing. The Department of Ed is doing some work on this in the areas of arts education grants. I think over the next few years, hopefully you will see some of the 800-pound gorillas in the grant-making field coming out with different sets of outcomes and evaluation measurements, and then hopefully you, as a smaller organization, going to a bunch of these people can say, I absolutely understand you want to see MECRM. Can we all agree to use the Wallace standard, or can we all agree to use the NEA standard for this, and then, and try and, people aren't crazy, everybody wants to feel like what they're doing is important, but I think if you tell them, in the last 2 years, the NEA has done this set of metrics around this particular type of grant, and, if we meet this, will that meet your expectations? Hopefully there'll be more of those kind of things coming out, both out of some of the major funding organizations like Wallace and MacArthur and Ford and things like that, and out of some of the government agencies.
And is there any talk about threshold within the council, or?
It's a committee, just sorry, I do that all the time, but just want to make that clear for the internets. Again, there's no way that as a presidential committee we could say, if you, person in Des Moines, Iowa, want to give a donation to your ballet, you're not allowed to ask for outcomes.
No, I understand that. I was.
So you're talking specifically federal.
Like if the federal government kind of streamlines what they do, what you were just saying, if the federal government streamlines what they're doing, then we as the fundees can say, well, the federal government's got it all worked out, can we all work by that? Yeah. So like the same thing with the federal government.
I haven't heard anything about a sliding scale of requirements depending on amount of the grant. I haven't, not that that's not out there, I just haven't heard anything about it.
In front.
I'm Richard Pettit from the National Endowment for the Humanities education programs. I lived in Germany for a while. I ran a small art gallery in Berlin back in the 80s, so I know a little bit about the cultural landscape there, and I can only second what you just said, that there is a vast difference just in the public's expectations of what cultural life should be and what the role of the government and public funding has to do with that. And I find it sadly lacking here, that consciousness. I had a question for you, Kristina. We've been talking about metrics or accountability, and we at the NEH, that's standard for all of the grants that we provide. How is this changing in Germany at all? Is Wüstenrot developing new standards of accountability for their grantees, or is it kind of level there?
Also es gibt eine staatlich festgelegte, es geht doch um Spendenbescheinigung, wenn ich das jetzt richtig verstanden habe, nicht? Um die Möglichkeit, die Spenden von den Steuern bei den Steuern geltend zu machen.
Nee, es geht um Evaluierung.
Bitte?
Das ist doch auch eine Art von Evaluierung, die da dran hängt.
Ja, und das gibt es ja.
Berichte.
Bitte?
Berichte, Evaluierung.
Ja, aber das gibt es ja im deutschen Spendensystem so nicht unbedingt. Also es gibt keine Berichtsnotwendigkeit dessen, der Spendenempfänger muss eine Spendenbescheinigung ausstellen, und wie die aussieht, das ist seitens des Finanzamtes geregelt. Und es gibt aber keine inhaltliche Berichtspflicht. Und die wird auch in der Regel nicht erwartet.
Und wie ist das bei staatlichen Stellen?
Wenn
Wenn staatliche Stellen finanzieren, gibt es dann eine entsprechende Berichtspflicht?
Ja, das ist also meines Wissens auch nicht.
Ganz selten.
Ja, das gibt es nicht.
Let's well, yes, give us an answer. Sorry.
It's as you can tell, it's a difficult question because the system is different in Germany. So there's not a requirement to reveal reports. In reports to say precisely to evaluate the type of arts funding or the individual artist or project, because the company funding the arts or the foundation would just hand this into the financial or tax authorities, but they do not have to list, if I understood it correctly, everything in a certain manner, that it would be very strictly evaluated. And also for state funding, this type of situation does not exist. So it's difficult to compare because it's a different system or tax code even in Germany.
Derjenige, der das Geld empfängt, muss nur bestätigen, dass er gemeinnützig handelt. Also und damit, also das erschöpft eigentlich schon diesen Bescheid. Es gibt keinen inhaltlichen Bericht über das, was man damit gemacht hat.
Okay, so whoever is funding the arts just has to prove that they're acting in a non-profit capacity, and but does not have to fill in all the blanks and give all the details of the precise nature of the project being funded.
But when somebody comes to you with a proposal, I want you to fund me teaching music to students in a school or teaching documentary photography, and maybe I don't, but in your country, but in my country I would say this will help them with their reading scores or their math scores, because they're going to have to learn photography, which has lots of math in it and apertures, and so you should fund me because I'm going to help school children in immigrant communities improve their testing scores through learning photography. Do you then require if you give me that money, do you require anything from me saying, I taught 60 children at the beginning of the year, their math scores were X, and by the end of the year, because of my program, their math scores were Y?
Also das ist dann, dann ist das ganz individuell geregelt. Also dann ist das wirklich eine zusätzliche Anfrage desjenigen, der spendet. Aber es gibt darüber keine Konvention in Deutschland.
If this were the case in Germany, and this is a big if, it's usually not the case, then this would be an additional question or query from whoever is providing the funding.
But is there an emphasis on that from funders, or is that not a big emphasis?
Nein, ist es nicht. Also es wird meines Wissens nicht sehr detailliert abgefragt, was da tatsächlich, also die Evaluation spielt eine untergeordnete Rolle, so muss man sagen.
No, there is not. As far as I know, there is no great emphasis placed on this, and this plays a lesser or subsidiary role.
It's so interesting. This goes back to what we were talking about before, this idea that we constantly have to prove this premise that the arts are worth it, and increasingly as an instrumentality to some other goal, educational reform or economic benefit, as opposed to arts for art's sake. And so it's just interesting because it speaks to that underlying issue of the position of the arts and cultures in our two different countries.
Es ist insofern interessant, da es in der Wissenschaftsförderung diese Berichtspflicht gibt und sie da flächendeckend eingefordert wird von staatlicher wie von unternehmerischer oder auch Stiftungsförderung.
It's interesting too because it's different in Germany when it comes to science funding. Funding for science reports are required, and this is actually the situation across the board for science funding, whether it comes from the state level or the corporate level, private or public.
I have to say, I lived in Europe for a while, and but not when I was working in the arts, and I can't imagine what it would be like not to be constantly on the defensive about the value of what I was doing. I'm coming home with you.
You're welcome.
There's another question back there.
My name is Joshua Ford from the Chief Program Officer at the Washington, D.C. Jewish Community Center. My question sort of speaks to an artistic ecosystem in each country. And I've always sort of carried around the pet theory that because American arts institutions are, because the government is a less reliable source of arts funding, particularly for early stage organizations and artists, that as a result, somewhat Darwin-esque, that the American arts community is much more resourceful and resilient when there are economic downturns. They're used to working with less. They don't count on that that kind of support. I don't know if there's any empirical analysis to bear that out. I'm wondering if the committee has looked at that, and I'm wondering if that is something that gets spoken about in European circles.
Yeah, so notwithstanding my recent impulse to immigrate to Europe, you know, it is in this game of, I mean, you definitely can't play the game of who has better artists or who whatever, but it is true that even in this environment, which has been true as long as, because the National Endowment of the Arts was only, and Humanities was only created 40 years ago, and IMLS was created much more recently. The arts have thrived in the United States. Nonprofit, we have some of the greatest and most provocative and interesting art, you know, coming out of this country that you see in the world, and it is, you know, somewhat Darwin-esque, and it's also kind of light and art affirming that, you know, that it works, and I want to pay due to that, and I think it's also a very big difference between us and Europe is that our commercial arts sector, you know, music and movie is, you know, I think intellectual property is the #1 export of the United States, back from my days as a copyright attorney. And this has happened without really any significant government intervention, and we have some of the world's most exciting and interesting, you know, musicians and movie makers and, you know, playwrights. And so there is something to be said. That is a fact, and that is something that as a country and as an artistic community, I think we should be really proud of.
What about the issue of resiliency when there are downtimes?
I think that is absolutely true. I don't know enough about how much art funding fluctuates even in downtimes in Europe, so I don't know how much variation there is there. But it is both the artists' in this country strength and weakness in terms of a public image that. The assumption is if they're really good and they really care, they will make art without anybody supporting them. You know, as opposed to lawyers, for example, who we believe as a society we have to pay a lot of money to in order to, you know, support them and get them to do this work. And you know, that as we talk about, for example, we're at the moment talking about an arts education initiative coming out of the committee, and you know, started thinking about it in terms of providing more job opportunities for artists to work as teaching artists in schools. And you know, that's a message that has limited play, that you know, that jobs for artists isn't a big selling point across the political spectrum, because it's perceived that art is something they will do whether or not they're employed. And again, that's not true for other disciplines.
Also ich denke auch, dass es natürlich stimmt, dass sich ein Bereich der Künstler, Musiker, Architekten, in welchem Bereich auch immer, sich von alleine durchsetzen kann. Aber diese Leute benötigen ja in keinster Weise Unterstützung. Also wer es sozusagen sowieso von selbst schafft, sich auf dem Markt zu etablieren, braucht keinerlei Unterstützung. Und das ist doch eigentlich genau der Punkt, wo der Staat, aber auch Stiftungen und vielleicht auch Privatleute einspringen müssen, diese kulturellen Einrichtungen, Projekte zu unterstützen, die vielleicht keine breite Öffentlichkeit finden, aber die wir dennoch als wichtigen Bestandteil unseres breiten Kulturverständnisses begreifen.
Well, of course it is true that certain artists can make it on their own, and it's great if they do. Certain artists can make it on their own and maybe don't need as much support. But it is precisely these people, these artists, who need less support because they're already making it on their own. So the key point, or the nexus of public funding, is whether it's the state or foundation or private funding, that we need to support those who have not yet made it on their own and who contribute to the broader cultural landscape, and it's precisely these people who would maybe have less of a chance if they did not receive this type of funding in the broader cultural context.
Okay. Last question? We have a last question or comment. We've had a fascinating discussion, and once again we sort of see where cultural divides, cultural history is different between Germany and the United States. We both have a federal system which makes us aware of the complications that are parallel on both sides, and yet our traditions are different. It sounds like some of us might say, oh, those spoiled German artists. On the other hand, where are our young people who are arts inclined going to be able, how are they going to be able to establish themselves, to take that time to develop their own talent? How is that going to happen if we don't have more consensus for the importance of the arts and the importance of supporting young artists in particular? So the uncertainty goes in both directions. I think that this has really been the opening of a much bigger question, and we don't have an answer for how our two societies will in the future handle these problems. But it seems to me that the public-private partnerships, the role of the state, the role of the local government, the role of foundations, the role of corporations, the role of individual in supporting the arts and cultural life is something that we need to work on in both places, which will be equally important on both sides of the Atlantic. So I want to thank you both. I want to thank you, Karen, for doing this. And please, this evening we have an opening here, right?
Yes.
An official opening of the photography exhibit. And 6:30, please come back for that. And we have many other programs at the Goethe-Institut, so please feel free to stop by and take a German class, see a film, and come to a discussion. So thank you for coming.